Age of Wonders 4 is focusing hard on its map generation, including the beloved continents map type, as well as a big focus on the underground. New features, new explorations, and hopefully better ways to build those precious cities down below. I'm JumboPixel. I haven't asked for a like in a while, so if you wouldn't mind leaving a like at the start of the video, let's jump in and take a look at what's changing in Age of Wonders 4. Taking a look at the hot off the press recent insights from the developers, the first thing that they talk about is map generation, and then they move through into specifically dealing with the underground. Now, to be honest, I think there's quite a lot of detail here, and for most viewers, most people like you and I, it's probably a bit much. But in essence, if I were to summarize it, they say that the random map generator is based on a whole load of features, and its foundation is set from Age of Wonders Planetfall. However, in Age of Wonders 4, they may have noticed that there are different provinces, different sizes, depending on actually what's on the map. So for example, a province may be very large if it's relatively desolate, it has a mountain range in it, or it might be relatively small if it has something like a golden ancient wonder, and this allows a bit of flexibility. My personal take here is that the size of territories in Age of Wonders is very good. They feel manageable, they feel relatively easy to connect, in comparison to, say, something like Humankind, where the world map is divided into very large swaths of land. Then they move through into what we could call the meat of this week's update, the underground, an area that we'll talk a little bit later in the video about, but to be honest, definitely needed some TLC. I found myself mostly ignoring it when the game first came out. They talk a little bit at the start about sort of setting up our base knowledge, and again, I think that this is probably a little bit overdone in the detail for most of us. However, it's still very interesting. They talk about when they're generating the underground map layer, they start with an empty map. They generate positions for things like cities, regions, and passages between them. Then they move through to features like ancient wonders, rivers, lava flow, regional flavor, and then finally, towards the end of the process, they're looking at structures, magic materials, provinces, and roads to bring it all together. That's basically how they work through the stepped process of generating the underground, if you were curious. Very much extra for experts. Now, next section I like to think of as why underground? They say that when they set out creating this underground layer and the generation that we just talked about, they had some goals in mind. They thought that players should be able to create viable underground empires, especially with that underground adaptation. My opinion at launch, this was not so much true. The underground should have a unique feel in terms of gameplay, look, structure, and encounters. I actually think that this one was tackled all right from the start. Lava, caverns, mushroom-filled battlefields, but of course more work to be done. And then the third point is that the underground should be readable and visually appealing. And that one, maybe I'll leave up to you to decide. Overall, I think that if we think about those goals and how they launched in Age of Wonders 4, at least in my personal opinion, the underground just wasn't as viable as the overworld. Area was in general, and is in general, smaller, less room to expand, less resources, potentially difficult to connect up, particularly if I think about the old magic victory condition. An underground city might just be too far out of the way, and maybe lacking a little bit of distinct flavor. So, how are they addressing this, and how are they working toward their goals? Well, one change that you may have already experimented with if you've been playing the open beta on PC on Steam, which I know is certainly not every player, in fact, probably a minority of players, I'd put my bottom dollar on that, is they trying to address this sort of underground is too restricted, how do we expand further? The change, of course, is that underground cities in the Watcher update can now expand up through underground passages and grab territories at the other layer of the map, the top layer, allowing us to potentially build cities in areas underground that might be smaller caverns, tight, confined spaces, but then reach up into the overworld. Also, potentially giving you access to better resources if the overworld is bountiful and full of wonderful things that we can eat and do. Players using the underground adaptation mind trait, they also added a little extra bonus. Basically, we get one additional annex range for our cities, so we can really reach out both within the cavern and up into the overworld. One of the defining features of the underground, and something that really separates it from the rest of the world, the overworld, is excavation. Now, in the Wyvern update, they made it so that nodes, resource nodes, or magical materials could be uncovered through excavation, but the experience could still feel lacking and too dangerous for scouts to handle by themselves. The roaming stacks were initially added in to reach the quota of fights to level up your stacks, they say during the early game, but besides forced fights, they didn't really give us much. Well, you'll notice that provinces with something special underneath them, like those resource nodes or magic materials, or maybe even an infestation of enemies, will now be glowing. It should help us, hopefully, find a good spot to settle at a glance and also sort of get a quick idea around where the value is at. When excavating a province, we'll of course uncover the structures and the defenders. The structures include their own rewards as well. Maybe particularly useful for a dragon leader looking to gather a whole lot of shields they can't carry. And that way, of course, we can decide how we want to react. Should we be careful? Should we fight? So on and so forth. And I think this change to excavation is a really good one because, as I mentioned at the start of this section, excavation is one of the key things that separates the underground from the overworld. So why not really lean into it? It's also, of course, great just in general for expansion now. The underground is much larger because you can bust bits of it apart and build farms and quarries and whatnot there instead. The final section on the underground, before we move through to the continents map and sort of the overworld map generation, is called structures in the developer's diary. I am, to be honest, not quite sure why. They say we've made a couple of adjustments to structures. We've made the ores group of magic materials be the only materials that spawn in the underground. Now, we already knew this. This was already in the open beta. I'm not quite sure why that's a structure. They move on to say there is now better distribution on the rarity of ancient wonders in the underground. These are most certainly structures of some kind, leading to a more varied pool. And when traversing the water, finally, there'll be the occasional resource pickup, making it potentially more worth our time. Again, I'm not quite sure how that's a structure, but if we step back from a wording that I find slightly unusual and a grouping of points that I find slightly unusual, these three changes are obviously all somewhat substantial. The one that's really pertaining to structures is the ancient wonders in the underground. Obviously now more important now that we need to collect golden wonders to get that victory. I've noticed I find the same golden ancient wonder underground next to my spawn almost every time, which is very handy. Let's move through now and talk about the final section, which is the continents map generation, something that was labeled as pretty dang boring and pretty dang samey by many players. So there was a problem with the continents map type in particular, and if you've played Age of Wonders many times like I have, you've probably felt this. Generally, it doesn't really feel a lot like continents, but more like these sort of big land masses that stretch across the entire map, and then there's kind of a forced large ocean or two. And that's basically what you get every time and time again. So to combat it, they've decided the generation process should have a bit more freedom. This includes the fact that they'll no longer force the shape of the ocean. I'm honestly kind of surprised that they did that in the first place. But they'll also allow it to generate smaller islands in the ocean. And this is kind of what excites me more about this, because this will allow a bit of difference. Continents don't just have to be massive, large land masses stretching from border to border in the map. They can actually be small, and they can actually be fragmented a little bit. And hopefully, looking at the images that they've provided, you can see the old version of continents, as I've described, so these big sort of lumbering land masses with large oceans. And in the new generation, it looks a bit more varied. The final thing that they note about the continents type is that they'll use these little islands that they're spawning, these smaller fragmented parts of continents, to connect to the underground. So there may be an underground passage on one of the islands that also bridges through to connect to another mainland form or continent. Hopefully, ultimately bringing in those changes that we've talked about with the underground into the overworld even better. And the idea of mixing these two worlds together, I think, will make them both a bit more robust and a bit more interesting. And that concludes this relatively short developer diary this week. It is always a bit unusual in approaching these because they have this open beta running, granted for a minority of players, but it's there. And maybe half of these changes you could already have been playing with. So they're kind of announcing things that are already out there. But then the other half are new. They're changes that they're making along the way to the open beta, or they're sort of more talking about their intentions for the full update. I'm happy to keep covering these developers' diaries. I think there is due to be one more before the release of the Watcher update. And of course, we'll jump into that once it's actually here and in our hands. Thank you very much for joining me today, everybody. I'll see you next time.